Upstate New York, fall of 1987. Just outside a small town where the leaves turned golden before October and where Main Street still smelled of cinnamon and old bookstores, there stood a modest nursing home tucked between tall oak trees and rusted iron fences. The kind of place that held more silence than conversation, more memory than movement. The brick building, once a family estate, had long been transformed into a quiet resting place for those whose lives had slowed to the rhythm of scheduled meals, pill cups, and soft-footed nurses who learned over time how to tell the difference between silence that meant peace and silence that meant pain. In a room facing the garden lived Walter, 82 years old, a former infantryman who'd served in Europe during World War II. He spoke little. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was too much he didn't know how to share anymore. He spent his days near the window, watching the breeze in the trees, the slow changing sky, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd reach for the small leather notebook on his bedside table, the one a young volunteer had encouraged him to start filling with memories. But most pages remained empty. On the morning it all changed. The rain tapped gently on the windows, like fingertips of someone long gone asking to be remembered. Breakfast was already being served in the common room, the smell of oatmeal and burnt toast drifting down the hall, when a new resident arrived. A woman, early 80s, grey hair pinned up carefully, walking with the grace of someone who had lived through storms and learned to hold herself steady. Her name was Margaret, a retired schoolteacher, recently widowed, quiet in a way that didn't come from age, but from knowing how to listen to a room before stepping into it. She walked in slowly, guided by a nurse to a seat 2 tables away from Walter, and that's when he saw her. He didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't breathe for just a moment, because something in her face, not the age, not the lines, something deeper, something in the eyes pulled him back to a different reign, to a crowded train station in Philadelphia, 1944, to the sound of announcements echoing off marble walls, to the kiss he gave her before boarding a train to a war he might not survive. He had believed she died, or vanished, or perhaps married and moved far away. And yet, here she was, 2 tables away, breathing the same air as if time hadn't passed, only paused. He said nothing. She didn't look up. But in his chest, a heartbeat he thought had long gone quiet began to rise again. If this story touches your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing real stories that inspire, surprise, and stay with you. And now, get ready, because what happens next changes everything. Philadelphia, summer of 1944, a city draped in wartime silence, where even the sunlit streets seemed muted under the weight of headlines, telegrams, and radio static whispering of battles far across the ocean. And yet, in the spaces between duty and dread, life persisted. Women queued patiently outside grocers, children played beneath crumbling stone stoops, and soldiers stood still on train platforms, faces half-shadowed by the knowledge that nothing after this would be the same. Walter was 21 when the war called him. Not with fanfare, not with a trumpet blast or patriotic chorus, but with the quiet arrival of an envelope, cream-colored and heavy with finality, marked by a seal that signaled the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. He had been raised in a modest home in West Philadelphia, the only child of a widowed mother who baked on Sundays and kept 3 books on the nightstand: a Bible, a photo album, and a war bond ledger. And though Walter had always imagined that his path might lead him toward books or trade, perhaps even into teaching, he folded the letter, packed his bag, and promised his mother he would come back. Margaret, barely 20, lived 4 blocks away and knew Walter only through a tangle of cousins and shared Sunday masses. But one late spring evening, in a church basement smelling of lemon polish and new hymnals, they spoke. And that conversation, no more than a dozen sentences long, somehow anchored them to each other with a gravity neither of them could explain nor resist. She, a librarian's assistant with a voice so soft it slowed conversations, loved poetry more than politics, and carried in her coat pocket a folded piece of paper where she scribbled words she wanted to remember. Not grand speeches, but everyday moments that felt too delicate to lose. Their time together unfolded like a secret. Quiet walks along the Schuylkill River, stolen minutes in doorways before curfew, hands brushing in passing but never clasping too tightly, as though they both understood that to hold something too firmly in wartime was to risk breaking it. And though they never dared to call it love, not in a world that swallowed young men whole and left behind only photographs and postmarked regret, it was love all the same, if love could be measured in stillness, in half-spoken thoughts, in the reverence of presence. The morning of Walter's deployment came without ceremony. Just a note slipped under the door, a reporting time, and a destination he was not allowed to say aloud. And so, beneath the high arches of Philadelphia's 30th Street station, among the swirl of uniforms and tear-streaked faces, he waited for Margaret, not knowing if she would come, not even sure if she had read between the lines of their last conversation, but hoping, with the full weight of chest, that she would appear before the whistle blew, and she did. She stepped onto the platform not with dramatics, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had made peace with uncertainty, her coat buttoned tight, her hair swept back, and her eyes searching only for him. And when she reached him, there were no tears, no speeches, only the exchange of a parcel wrapped in brown paper, bread, chocolate, and a handwritten note she begged him not to open until he was far from here. And then a silence between them so full it left no room for anything else. Walter, though he had practiced a dozen things to say, found that all language abandoned him in the presence of her gaze. And so, when the call came for boarding, he did the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing that felt true. He kissed her, not gently, not tentatively, but with the weight of all he could not carry, with the urgency of a man who understood that this moment might be the last anchor to who he had been before war turned everything into ash. She held him for half a second longer than time allowed. Then he turned, boarded, the train pulled away. And Margaret, still, composed, unmoving, stood alone on the platform, one hand resting over her chest, as though to steady the echo of something that had just been torn loose and left behind. Days later, the station would be damaged in a bombing raid, meant for the yards beyond, not destroyed but wounded, and with it the records, the letters, the rail lines of connection between one life and another. And while Margaret wrote faithfully for months, her envelopes were returned unopened, or not returned at all, and eventually, in the absence of confirmation, a telegram arrived stating the Tsar at Private Walter Harris was missing in action, presumed dead, no further details, condolences offered. She told no one. She married a doctor years later, had children, a dog, a life. But in a small box on the top shelf of her closet, she kept the note she'd written and the button from the cuff of his uniform jacket, the one that came loose as he stepped away. As for Walter, wounded, unconscious, and unidentifiable for weeks, he was eventually shipped to a convalescent ward in England, then reassigned, and by the time he made it home, the war was over and the girl at the station was gone. No address, no trail, only the memory of a kiss that refused to fade, even when everything else did. Time, in the years following the war, did not sweep in like a healer with clean white gloves and quiet assurances, but rather settled like dust over every surface of memory. Soft at first, barely visible, until one day you looked back and realized just how thick it had become, how much of your past it had buried without your consent. For Margaret, the war ended with the kind of silence that doesn't arrive all at once, but builds gradually, like water rising slowly past the threshold of a closed door, soaking into everything, till one day you simply accept that some voices will never return. She didn't cry when the telegram came, not because she didn't feel it, but because she had already cried weeks earlier. alone in the dark of her childhood bedroom when her letters began returning unopened, when the silence on the other end of the world grew too loud to bear. She tucked the message into a drawer she rarely opened, placed the button and the letter next to it, and told herself that some goodbyes never get spoken aloud. They just settle in the bones, like an ache you learn to walk with. Her marriage came 3 years later. A man named Richard, a physician, gentle, reliable, whose quiet patience was something she mistook for safety, and in some ways, it was. He never asked about her life before they met, never pressed when she gazed too long out the window during rainstorms. And when she smiled, he smiled back, believing it was for him, unaware that some smiles live in the past and are only borrowed in the present. They had 2 children, both boys, both strong and loud and full of joy, and Margaret loved them with a fierce protective tenderness that never wavered, even when the nights grew long or the house too quiet after they'd grown and gone. She was a good mother, a good wife, and in time she became a respected teacher, filling classrooms with the steady rhythm of grammar lessons and Shakespearean verses, her voice always even, always warm, even when her heart was far away, drifting backward through time toward a train station, echoing with the memory of one kiss. She never spoke Walter's name again. Not to her husband, not to her sons. But some nights, long after the world around her had gone still, she would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold and close her eyes. And in that silence, the scent of his jacket would rise again, faint as fog, and she would remember not what he looked like, but how he made her feel. Walter's return to America was not triumphant. It was fragmented, broken, and shadowed by a body that no longer moved the way it had, and a mind haunted by flashes of smoke, screaming, and names he couldn't forget. The kind of return that makes you feel like a ghost inside your own country. The convalescent ward in England had done what it could for the visible wounds, but what it could not repair, what no doctor ever touched, was the rupture inside him, the one that came not from shrapnel, but from a memory, a train pulling away, and a girl's face growing smaller in the distance. He asked about her when he got home, quietly, cautiously, at first in Philadelphia, and then in letters he never sent. But time had moved on, addresses changed, families scattered, and there was no trace of her to be found. Eventually he stopped asking, not because he no longer cared, but because it hurt too much to hear himself speak of her in the past tense. He moved north, away from the city, away from the echoes, and took work in a library, shelving books by day, reading by night, alone but never truly lonely, because in his silence lived a memory so clear, so complete, that it filled the room with her presence. He never married, not out of bitterness, not out of grief, but because somewhere inside him, he still held that kiss like a pressed flower inside a forgotten novel, fragile, faded, but entirely intact. He kept her note, the one she told him to read after he left, folded inside a copy of Leaves of Grass, worn and soft at the edges. He read it every year on the same date, the day he boarded that train. And each time, it left him with the same ache, not sharp, but persistent, like something he was meant to carry. His neighbors thought him kind, if a bit distant. He paid his taxes, fed stray cats, donated books to the local school. No one ever asked why his home had no photographs. No one noticed the small wooden box on his nightstand that never moved. The decades passed with the quiet efficiency of time, uninterested in grief. Margaret buried her husband in 79. Walter retired in 83, and by then the world had changed so much. Computers in libraries, airports replacing train stations, letters giving way to phone calls, that their story seemed almost out of place, like an unfinished melody playing beneath a modern symphony. And yet, neither of them forgot. She kept the button, he kept the letter, and somewhere inside both of them, in a place beyond words or reason, they still waited, not for answers, not for explanations, but for the impossible, to see each other again, to finish the sentence neither of them had spoken aloud, To remember that sometimes love doesn't die. It just waits. In the days following Margaret's arrival at the nursing home, something subtle shifted in the rhythm of the place. Not loud enough for the staff to notice, not dramatic enough for the residents to comment on, but quiet and steady, like a new note added to an old melody. And though Walter said nothing, changed nothing, did nothing outwardly different, those who knew him well might have noticed his eyes lifted more often now from the pages of the books he never really read, how he lingered just a moment longer in the common room each morning, as though waiting for something he hadn't quite let himself believe was real. Margaret, for her part, seemed to sense the weight of recognition too, though she carried it with the same composure she had worn all her life. Measured steps, polite greetings, a voice still soft, still certain, still wrapped in the cadence of someone who knew how to leave things unsaid. And while she hadn't yet looked directly at Walter, at least not long enough for it to become a moment, the "Bree" was something about the way her breath caught, just barely, when passing the corner where he always sat, that made the air around them hum with something unspoken. They shared a space, but not yet a word. And yet the distance between them, 30 feet of carpet, 2 tables, and a world of years, felt at times thinner than a heartbeat, as if any sudden sound might pierce the veil of time and bring everything rushing back. And then, one Wednesday afternoon, it happened. It was music hour in the rec room. A weekly ritual meant more for routine than joy, though now and then a familiar tune could reach past memory's erosion and strike something pure in the heart. A volunteer violinist, kind-eyed and gentle with the bow, played mostly standards, the songs of the 30s and 40s that once filled jukeboxes and parlors, now drifting like ghosts through hallways where time no longer ran in a straight line. That day, she played "I'll Be Seeing You," not loud, not fast, but slow, aching, delicate. And when the melody settled into the room, it was no longer just music, it was a doorway. Margaret, seated near the window with her hands folded in her lap, breathed in once, sharply, as if the song had pierced something inside her, and then, almost imperceptibly, began to hum along, her voice trembling not from age, but from recognition too deep to steady. Walter turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, like someone hearing their own name whispered in a dream. And then he stood, slowly, carefully, and walked toward her with the fragile determination of someone crossing not just a room, but an entire lifetime. She looked up, their eyes met, and in that instant, the years collapsed. Not erased, not forgotten, but folded, like a letter kept too long in a drawer, open now with trembling hands. He didn't ask, "Is it really you?" She didn't say, "I thought you died." Instead, he said softly, almost reverently, as if offering a truth instead of a question, "You remember the song?" Her lips parted, but no sound came for a moment. Then with a small, broken smile, she said, "I never forgot," and that was enough. They sat together in the quiet that followed, not needing to explain what decades had already said in their stead. Because sometimes words are too small to carry the weight of absence, and sometimes two people can speak volumes simply by being near one another again. Over the following days, they began to spend more time in the garden, in the reading room, on the bench under the elm, where the birds came close enough to be mistaken for messengers. Not talking endlessly, not telling every detail of the years they had lost, but exchanging memories in pieces, like puzzle parts that still fit after all this time. She told him about her husband, the good man who never asked too much. He told her about his books, the library, the silence that never quite let go. They spoke of small things, autumns, apples, poems, rain, and when they were quiet, it wasn't awkward, it was sacred, because silence shared is different from silence born alone. One afternoon, beneath a fading sun, Margaret took a small cloth bundle from her sweater pocket and handed it to him, wrapped carefully in time-softened linen, tied with a pale blue ribbon. Inside was the button, The one from his coat, the one that came loose that day at the station, the one she had kept all this time. Walter held it in his palm as if it were made of glass. His fingers closed around it slowly, and for the first time in years, not out of pain, not from a memory, but from something warmer. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her. And she nodded, as if to say, "Yes, I've been waiting too." From the day they found each other again, not with grand declarations or cinematic embraces, but with the quiet steadiness of two people who had spent a lifetime carrying a shared silence, Margaret and Walter fell into a rhythm that didn't chase time, didn't fight against what was already lost, but simply honored what still remained. There was no need for labels, for explanations, or for words like love or regret, because what they had now was not built from the urgency of youth or the promises of forever, but from something older, softer, and infinitely more rare. The quiet understanding that even after decades apart, some hearts remember how to speak the same language. Each morning, Walter would wait by the hallway window that overlooked the east garden, not out of impatience, but because that's where the light first entered the building, and he liked the way it spilled across the floorboard. And when Margaret arrived, always with a book or a folded crossword puzzle in hand, he would greet her with a nod that meant everything and nothing all at once. A gesture that said, "You're here. That's enough." They didn't need constant conversation, they needed presence, and presence in their world was a kind of prayer. They took their tea at 10 a.m., always at the same table in the sunroom where the ivy grew wild outside the windows, curling and climbing toward a sky they no longer tried to name. And though their hands shook sometimes when lifting the cups, there was still a steadiness between them, a kind of gravity that held them in place without force. Walter would read aloud from books Margaret chose, sometimes poetry, sometimes essays, sometimes pages so worn the ink had faded into soft smudges. And even when his voice wavered or the words caught in his throat, she never interrupted, never corrected, only listened, her eyes never leaving his face. Afternoons were spent in the garden if the weather allowed, not walking, not really, but moving slowly along the path between the rose bushes and the old wooden bench where time seemed to slow even more. And there, with the scent of lilac and lavender rising in waves, they would speak of things not lost, but remembered. Childhood summers, long-forgotten recipes, the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. One day, as October faded into its golden final days, Margaret brought a small linen pouch with her to the garden. She handed it to Walter with a look that said, "This has waited long enough." And inside, wrapped in a delicate handkerchief, was the note she had given him on the day he left, the one he'd never opened because he had been too afraid of what it might say, too certain it would hurt to. Read what he could no longer answer. His hands, trembling slightly, unfolded the paper, and the words in her own young handwriting came back like a breath held for 50 years. "If you don't come back, I'll still remember you every time I hear the sound of a train. I'll still love you, but I'll keep living because that's what you'd want. But if you do come back, even if it takes forever, find me." He didn't cry. He simply placed the letter in his lap and reached for her hand. And when their fingers touched, it wasn't the closing of a circle. It was the quiet blooming of something that had waited through storms and stillness to finally be held. As the weeks passed, there were days when Walter's body betrayed him. Small spells of dizziness, long pauses between thoughts, moments when sleep came before he realized the day had ended. And Margaret, who had once feared this reunion would only sharpen the ache of eventual goodbye, found instead that it brought peace, not pain. Because now there was no wondering, no unanswered question, no, "Hey, what if?" They had found each other, they had returned, and even if the time remaining was short, it was enough. More than enough. There were no photographs taken, no visitors who asked too many questions, no staff notes that tried to define what their connection was. Only the quiet acknowledgement among nurses and aides that something rare and right was happening in the space between room 214 and the East Wing garden. And sometimes, during meals, other residents would pause and glance at the two of them, seated side by side, passing sugar or sharing a small laugh. And they would feel something stir, something they couldn't quite name, but which felt like hope, like memory, like proof that even now, even here, love could arrive without fanfare and still change everything. On one of their last evenings together, as twilight stretched long over the garden path, Margaret whispered to Walter something she had carried all this time. Not a confession, but a simple truth. I never stopped waiting. I just stopped expecting. And he, resting his hand gently over hers, replied, that was enough. It happened on a Sunday night, quiet and cold, the kind of night when even the clocks seemed to tick more slowly, and the wind outside the windows barely stirred the branches. And in that silence, as the nursing home settled into its usual hush, with hall lights dimmed and blankets pulled up to aging chins, Walter Harris slipped out of the world the same way he had re-entered hers, without noise, without ceremony, and entirely on his own terms. The nurse on duty later said she thought he was only sleeping, that he looked peaceful, almost smiling, his hands folded neatly over the soft handkerchief that never left his bedside table, the one with her initials embroidered in fading blue thread. And when she leaned in to adjust his blanket, she noticed the small notebook resting open beside him, its pages filled in a handwriting shakier thee, and it had once been, but unmistakably his. The final page was dated just 2 days before. The sentence he had written, and left uncrossed, unedited, completely whole, was this: "Thank you for waiting, even when you didn't know you were." Margaret was told the next morning, gently, carefully, by someone who didn't know the full story and could never have guessed the depth behind her stillness when she heard. And while she did not cry, not then, not later, not in front of anyone, the way she folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes told everyone who saw her that a chapter had ended. Not just in Walter's life, but in hers as well. She kept living as she always had, quietly, thoughtfully, fully. But something about her presence changed in the weeks that followed, as though her shadow moved differently in the light, softer, slower, yet somehow fuller. As if the grief did not take something from her, but returned something instead, like a message finally delivered after too many years in transit. Every morning she walked the same path through the garden. Every afternoon she sat by the window in the reading room with a book open in her lap, even if her eyes rarely moved across the page. And every evening, just before dinner, she would unfold the note, that letter he never read until years after it was written, and press her fingers to the paper like it was skin, like it could still carry warmth. She never remarried, never moved, never spoke much about Walter to the others, not because she wanted to keep him a secret, but because she knew some stories don't survive retelling. Some are not meant to be explained, only remembered. And so she became a quiet kind of legend in the home. Not a myth, not a ghost story, but a living memory, known by nurses and aides as the woman who once loved a man she thought was gone forever, only to find him again in the very last season of her life. New residents would sometimes ask about her. They'd hear whispers. "She's the one from the love story," someone might say, and others would nod, not knowing the details, only sensing that they were near something sacred, something rare. And Margaret, with her cup of tea and her wool sweater and her book she rarely finished, would smile softly when she heard them. Not with pride, not with sorrow, but with the peace of someone who had once lost everything and been given, against all odds, the chance to find it again. She didn't need more years. She didn't need to rewrite the past. She had the note, the button, the kiss, the time that remained, and in the end, that was enough. If this story moved you even a little, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share real stories, stories that heal, surprise, and stay with us long after the last word. We post new stories every day. Stories about love, about loss, and about finding your way back even when it feels too late.